This is part 1 of my 2019 Apple device collection, the iPads. Up first, we have an iPad first generation 64GB on iOS 3.2. A 16GB iOS 4.2.1. A 16GB iOS 5.1, a 16GB 5.1.1, a 64GB 5.1.1 in bad condition. This will be a restoration video later on. Now iPad 2 second generations. This is a 32GB on iOS 4.3. A 32GB iOS 4.3.5. A 16GB iOS 5.1.1. A 16GB iOS 6.1.3. A 16GB iOS 9.3.1. And it's still on beta firmware. Now the third generation iPads. A 64GB iOS 5.1. A 16GB iOS 5.1. A 16GB iOS 6.1.3. A 16GB iOS 9.3.1. Fourth generation iPads. iOS 16GB iOS 4.6.0.1. Now on to the newer iPads. iPad Air iOS 7.0.3. iPad 5th generation iOS 10.3.2. Sixth generation iOS 11.4. iPad Air 2 64GB iOS 8.1.2. $256GB iPad Air 3rd generation. iPad Pro 10.5, 512GB on iOS 10.3.3. Now on to the iPad minis. iPad mini, first generation, iOS 6.1. 32 gigabyte. 16 gigabyte iPad mini first generation on iOS 6.1.2. I mean, it's a 32 gigabyte, not 16. $16 GB iPad mini first generation on iOS 7.0.2. Another 16 gigabyte iPad mini first generation on iOS 7.1. iPad mini first generation on iOS 8.0.2. 16 gigabyte. iPad mini 2 on iOS 7.0.4. 16 gigabyte. iPad mini 4th generation on iOS 9.2.1, and this is a 64 gigabyte. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please comment, rate, and subscribe.